One standard year had passed since the hospital ships launched into the quarantine zones, and the Galactic Senate had gathered once again in its great crystal chamber. This time, every seat was filled. Species that had not sent representatives in decades had dispatched their highest officials. The air hummed with translation devices working at maximum capacity as hundreds of languages competed for attention. Everyone knew why they were here. Everyone knew what needed to be discussed. The humans had changed everything, Senator. Crickstall of the Mordani Collective rose from his seat, and the chamber fell silent with an immediacy that spoke to the gravity of the moment. His forearms were folded across his chest in a posture that combined humility with resolve. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the contempt that had marked his words a year ago. "I owe this chamber an apology," he began. "1 year ago, I called the Human Relief Mission political theater and dismissed Ambassador Yoon's announcement as the gesture of a naive species seeking attention." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "I was wrong." Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates, but Crickstall continued before they could swell into conversation. "The Valkyrie plague has been contained," he announced. Human medical teams, working alongside volunteers from 17 other species who joined after the humans showed it could be done, have saved an estimated 400 million lives. 112 human volunteers died in this effort. Not one of them asked to be withdrawn. Not one of them stopped working until they physically could not continue. Crickstall touched a control on his podium, and holographic displays appeared throughout the chamber showing a cascade of data and images. "But the plague response is only part of the story," he said. "Mordani Intelligence has compiled a comprehensive report on human activities over the past year." The displays shifted to show the Zethari Dominion. "The Zethari have signed a non-aggression treaty with Earth," Crickstall announced. "Not because they were threatened or coerced, but because human agricultural technology has begun alleviating food shortages in their outer territories." Supreme Commander Vorath, who personally led the raid on the human colony of New Bizin, has reportedly told his emperor that the humans are the most unsettling species he has ever encountered. Not because of their military capabilities, because they responded to his aggression with kindness. The displays shifted again, showing the Kethrani homeworld. The Kethrani, a species we all assumed would be extinct within 3 centuries, have announced that their population decline has stabilized for the first time in 200 years. Crickstall continued. Human terraforming equipment is rebuilding their atmosphere. Human agricultural scientists are restoring their soil. And human genetic specialists are working to ensure that future generations will be born healthy and strong. The Kethrani Elder Council has declared humanity to be eternal friends of their species. That declaration will be remembered by every Kethrani child born from this day forward. Crickstall lowered his arms and looked around the chamber at the assembled faces of 100 different species. "I once thought humans were dangerous because they might attack us," he said quietly. "I was looking at the wrong danger entirely. Humans are dangerous because they are kind. They are dangerous because they walk into plague zones and burning buildings and radiation fields to save strangers. They are dangerous because they offer food to enemies and salvation to the dying without asking for anything in return. They are dangerous because they have no fear." His voice rose with each sentence, not in anger, but in something closer to awe. "A species that does not fear death cannot be threatened," he declared. "A species that sacrifices itself for strangers cannot be predicted. And a species that responds to attack with compassion cannot be fought using any strategy we have ever developed. The humans are building something none of us understood until it was already taking shape. They are building a galaxy that loves them, not through conquest, not through manipulation, through simple, relentless, terrifying kindness. Crickstall stepped back from his podium, and for a long moment no one else moved. Then Ambassador Yoon Se-han rose from her seat in the human delegation section. She walked to the central platform with the same quiet confidence she had displayed a year ago. And she looked around at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization with eyes that held no triumph, no satisfaction, no pride, only warmth. Senator Crickstall speaks as though humanity has some grand strategy, she said, and her voice was soft but carried to every corner of the chamber. I want to be clear that we do not. We are not trying to make you dependent on us. We are not trying to build an empire of gratitude. We are simply doing what we believe is right. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Humanity spent thousands of years learning hard lessons about what happens when people stop caring about each other. She continued, we learned that cruelty breeds cruelty, that fear breeds fear, that violence breeds violence. But we also learned that kindness breeds kindness, that hope breeds hope, that when you help someone without expecting anything in return, you create something more powerful than any weapon. You create trust. Yoon looked directly at Crickstall, and something that might have been gratitude flickered across her face. The senator asks what happens when a dozen species owe humans everything, she said. I would answer that question differently. What happens is that those dozen species learn they can trust the galaxy to help them when they need it. And then they start helping others. And then those others do the same. Until eventually, we have a galaxy where no one suffers alone. Where every species protects every other species. Where the strong help the weak because that is simply what civilization means. She smiled. The same gentle smile that had unnerved diplomats and generals across known space. Humanity does not want to rule you, she said. We want to live alongside you as friends and partners in building something beautiful. That is all we have ever wanted. That is all we will ever want. The chamber was silent as she returned to her seat. Silent. And afraid, because every senator in that room understood the same truth. The humans were not trying to conquer them. And that was precisely why, given enough time, the humans would win, not through force, not through manipulation, through the simple, unstoppable power of being the species that cared when no one else would. The session ended without any formal resolution. What was there to resolve? The humans had not threatened anyone. They had not broken any laws. They had simply been kind, over and over again, until kindness itself became the most terrifying force in the galaxy. As the delegates filed out of the chamber, conversations hummed with the same questions that had haunted Mordani intelligence and Zethari High Command and Kathrani elders. How do you compete with a species that does not want to win? How do you defend against an enemy that only wants to help you? How do you fight kindness? The answer, they were beginning to realize, was that you could not. You could only surrender to it, and perhaps, whispered a few brave voices in the corridors of power, that would not be such a terrible thing after all. Elder Counselor Mivith of the Kathrani stood at the window of her chamber, watching the dying sun cast its feeble light across a landscape that had once been green with life. Now there was only dust and rock and the skeletal remains of forests that had perished generations ago. The Kathrani were a dying species. Everyone in the galaxy knew it. Though few spoke of it openly, 3 colony worlds remained to them, each one failing in its own way as environmental collapse spread like a slow disease through soil and atmosphere alike. Their population had fallen by 60% in the past 2 centuries at current rates of decline. There would be no Kathrani left within. Another 300 years, Mivith had accepted. This truth long ago, she had watched her own children grow up knowing they would be among the last generations of their kind. She had attended council meetings where the only topic was how to manage decline rather than prevent it. She had stopped hoping for miracles because hope was a luxury her people could no longer afford. So when her aide announced that a human delegation had arrived requesting an audience, Mivith felt nothing but tired confusion. The humans had no reason to visit a dying world. The Kethrani had nothing to offer. No resources worth extracting, no strategic position worth controlling, no technology worth acquiring. They were simply waiting to fade away while the galaxy watched with polite disinterest. Yet the humans had come anyway. Mivith received them in the Council's Great Hall, a chamber that had once hosted thousands of delegates, but now echoed with emptiness. Ambassador Yoon Se-han entered with a small team of humans, carrying equipment cases, and she approached Mivith with the same calm smile that recordings from the Galactic Senate had made famous across known space. "Elder Counselor," Yoon said, bowing in what Mivith recognized as a human gesture of deep respect. "Thank you for seeing us. I confess I do not understand why you are here," Mivith replied, a voice carrying the weariness of someone who had stopped expecting good news long ago. "The Kethrani have nothing that would interest a rising power like Earth. You have yourselves," Yoon said simply. "That is enough." She gestured to her team, who began unpacking their equipment cases. "Earth has been observing the Kethrani situation for some time," Yoon continued. "We believe your environmental collapse can be reversed with the right intervention." Mivith felt something stir in her chest, something she had not felt in decades. She forced it down. "Many species have studied our situation," she said carefully. "All have concluded that reversal is impossible without resources we do not possess, which is why Earth is prepared to provide those resources." Yoon activated a holographic display showing technical schematics that Mivith did not fully understand. Terraforming equipment, Yoon explained. Atmospheric processors that can restore your air quality within 50 years. Soil regeneration systems that can bring dead land back to productivity within 20. Additionally, we have genetic preservation specialists who can help stabilize your population's breeding viability, and long-term settlement planners who can redesign your colonial infrastructure for sustainability. Mivith stared at the display, her heart's pounding in a rhythm she had almost forgotten. "What do you want in return?" she asked, because there was always something. No species gave away resources on this scale without expecting payment. "Nothing." Yoon said the word hung in the air like an impossible thing. "I do not understand." Mivith whispered, "Your survival is payment enough." Yoon replied, and her voice was gentle as morning light. "The Kethrani are beautiful people with a rich culture and a history worth preserving. We do not want to watch you disappear. We want to help you live." Mivith felt moisture gathering at the corners of her eyes, a physical response she had not experienced since childhood. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why would you do this for strangers who cannot repay you?" Yoon was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "On Earth, there is a concept called legacy," she finally said. "Not just what we leave behind when we die, but what we create while we live. Humans want our legacy to be a galaxy where species help each other, where no one is left to suffer alone, where the strong protect the weak, not because they gained something from it, but because protection is simply what the strong should do. If we save the Kethrani, we prove that such a galaxy is possible. That proof is worth more to us than anything you could offer in trade." Mivith turned away from the human ambassador, looking out the window at the dying landscape that had haunted her dreams for so many years, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She imagined that landscape covered with green. She imagined children running through fields of crops. She imagined a future that was not simply managed decline. "The Elder Council will need to vote," she said, a voice thick with emotion she could not hide. "But I believe the answer will be yes. We will accept your help." When word of the human intervention reached the Galactic Senate, the reaction was not what anyone expected. There was no relief. There was no celebration. Instead, there was fear. because the senators understood what the humans were truly building, not an empire of conquest, something far more dangerous. The Kethrani would remember this kindness forever. Their children would grow up knowing that humans had saved them when no one else cared. Their gratitude would last for generations, binding them to Earth with ties stronger than any treaty or alliance. And the Kethrani were not alone. The plague victims remembered human doctors who had died trying to save them. The Zethari outer colonies were beginning to receive human agricultural technology. Species across the galaxy were learning that humanity asked for nothing and gave everything. The humans were not building an empire. They were building a family and families. The senators realized with growing alarm, would fight for each other with a ferocity that no military alliance could match. What happens when a dozen species owe humans everything? What happens when gratitude becomes loyalty and loyalty becomes love? The answer was becoming clear, and it terrified everyone who understood the implications. Supreme Commander Vorath of the Zethari Dominion stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the tactical display as his raiding fleet approached the human colony world designated New Bizon. The colony was small by galactic standards, home to perhaps 300,000 humans spread across a dozen settlements on a world that had been terraformed. Barely 50 years ago, it was also poorly defended, with only a handful of orbital stations and a modest planetary militia. The perfect target for what Vorath had planned. All ships report ready for engagement, announced his tactical officer, a young Zethari whose scales were still bright with the colors of youth. Civilian evacuation appears to be underway on the surface. Vorath allowed himself a thin smile. Of course, the humans would try to evacuate. They would resist. They would fight, and eventually they would be overwhelmed. Then Earth would respond with threats and demands. And the Zethari Dominion would have exactly what it needed. Proof that humanity was just another aggressive species that could be manipulated through standard military pressure. The raid itself was almost an afterthought. What mattered was the reaction it would provoke. Begin the operation, Vorath commanded. The next 3 hours went exactly as planned. Human defense forces fought with surprising determination. But they were hopelessly outmatched. Zethari landing troops secured 2 settlements before human reinforcements could arrive, taking several hundred prisoners in the process. By the time the Dominion fleet withdrew, they had demonstrated their military superiority without suffering meaningful losses. Vorath expected furious diplomatic protests. He expected sanctions and trade embargoes. He expected the humans to rattle whatever weapons they had and make threatening noises about retaliation. What he did not expect was the message that arrived at Zethari Prime 2 weeks later. Ambassador Yum Sehan requested a diplomatic meeting, not to negotiate prisoner release, not to deliver ultimatums, simply to talk. Vorath attended the meeting himself, partly out of curiosity and partly because he wanted to personally witness the moment when human diplomatic pretense crumbled into the same aggressive posturing that every other species eventually displayed. The meeting took place on a neutral station in unclaimed space, in a conference room designed to accommodate species of various sizes. Vorath arrived with a full security detail and took his position at one end of a long table. Ambassador Yun arrived alone. She was smaller than he had expected. This human who had challenged the entire Galactic Senate with her plague relief announcement, yet she moved with the same strange confidence he had seen in recordings of her Senate address. Supreme Commander, she said, inclining her head in what he assumed was a human gesture of respect. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I am curious what you hope to accomplish, Vorath replied, letting a hint of contempt enter his voice. Your colony was raided. Your people were taken prisoner, and you want to talk? I want to understand. Yoon said simply. The Zethary Dominion has conquered 9 star systems in the past century. Yet your core worlds show signs of severe resource strain. Vorath felt his scales stiffen in surprise. Your outer territories suffer from chronic food shortages. Yoon continued, her voice gentle rather than accusatory. Your population growth has outpaced your agricultural capacity, and your government has been unable to solve the problem through internal development. You have been studying us. Vorath growled. We study everyone, Yoon admitted. It helps us understand what people actually need rather than what they say they want. She reached into her bag and withdrew a data tablet. Sliding it across the table toward him, Earth would like to offer the Zethary Dominion access to our agricultural enhancement technology, she said. Specifically, our orbital hydroponic systems and high-yield crop varieties that can grow in the soil conditions common to your outer territories. Vorath stared at the tablet without touching it. You attack our colony and take our people prisoner. Yoon continued, and we offer you food technology in response. This is insane, Vorath said finally, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. You should be demanding revenge, not offering gifts. Would revenge feed the hungry children in your outer systems? The question hit Vorath like a physical blow. He had seen those children during his inspections of Frontier worlds. He had watched them grow thin and weak while the Dominion poured resources into military expansion. That was supposed to solve the problem through conquest. We are also prepared to offer educational exchanges for young Zethary who wish to study Earth agricultural sciences, Yoon added. And we would like to establish a permanent diplomatic channel to discuss what other challenges your society faces. She leaned forward slightly, her strange flat eyes meeting his own. I want to understand what wounds drive your people toward conquest. Supreme Commander, she said softly, because I believe those wounds can be healed through means other than war. Vorath stood abruptly, his security detail tensing around him. This meeting is over, he announced. Yoon simply nodded and rose from her seat. The offer remains open, she said, for as long as you need to consider it. She left the room without another word, and Vorath stood frozen in place for a long time afterward. Later, alone in his quarters aboard his flagship, he composed a classified report to the Zethary Emperor. The humans do not think like predators, he wrote. They also do not think like prey. They think like something else entirely, something I do not have a name for. They responded to military aggression with an offer of assistance, not because they are weak, but because they genuinely believe they can solve problems without violence. I recommend we avoid further provocation until we understand what we are actually dealing with, because I am no longer certain that standard military calculations apply to this species at all. He sent the report and sat in darkness, thinking about hungry children and the strange small woman who had somehow made him feel ashamed of victories he had spent his entire career achieving. Intelligence analyst Thesa of the Mordani Collective sat alone in her darkened office, surrounded by floating holographic screens that cast pale blue light across her gray skin as she scrolled through data that made less sense with every passing hour. 3 months had passed since the humans launched their hospital ships into the quarantine zones. 3 months of watching and waiting and trying to understand the numbers on her screens should have told a simple story of failure and retreat. 47 human medical volunteers had died from plague exposure. In the first 90 days alone, the protective equipment that other species considered worthless had proven exactly as inadequate as predicted. And human after human had succumbed to the same horrible dissolution that claimed the original victims. By every logical calculation, the mission should have collapsed, recruitment should have stopped, the hospital ship should have withdrawn to safer positions while Earth quietly abandoned its grand humanitarian gesture instead. Thesa was staring at recruitment figures that showed a 30% increase in volunteer applications since the death toll became public. She pulled up the latest report from Ordani observers, embedded with the human relief teams, her four eyes scanning the text with growing unease. Subject volunteer Kim Dae-yeon, age 24, standard years, assigned to intensive care unit on hospital ship Mercy's Hand. The report began. When informed that his predecessor in the position had died from plague exposure 6 days prior, Subject Kim responded with the following statement: "Someone has to do this work, and I would rather it be me than someone with children waiting at home." Thesa closed the file and opened another. Subject volunteer Park Ji-won, age 31, standard years, refused evacuation after initial plague symptoms manifested. This report read: Subject continued treating patients for an additional 12 days before becoming incapacitated, stating that her remaining time was better spent helping others than lying in a hospital bed feeling sorry for herself. File after file told the same impossible story. Humans who knew they were dying continued to work until their bodies physically failed. Humans who watched their friends dissolve still showed up for their shifts the next day. Humans who had every reason to flee instead asked how they could do more. Thesa pushed back from her desk and pressed her upper hands against her face, trying to process what she was seeing. This was not how sapient beings behaved. Every species in the galaxy operated on fundamental principles of self-preservation, modified by varying degrees of social bonding and tribal loyalty. You protected your own people because they were your people. You helped your allies because they might help you in return. You made sacrifices when the mathematics of survival demanded it. But humans were dying for strangers. They were dying for members of species they had never met, in systems they had no connection to, with no expectation of reward or even recognition. Thesa began pulling up historical records from Earth, searching for patterns that might explain what she was witnessing. What she found made her blood run cold. The humans had always been like this. She found records of something called firefighters, humans who ran into burning buildings to rescue people they did not know. She found records of humans who donated pieces of their own bodies to save sick strangers. She found records of humans who threw themselves onto explosive devices to protect nearby civilians, accepting certain death to give others a few extra seconds of life. One particular incident caught her attention: a disaster at a place called Chernobyl, where a power facility had suffered catastrophic failure and released lethal radiation across a wide area. Humans had walked into that radiation knowing it would kill them. They had done it anyway because someone had to, and because stopping the spread of contamination would save others. Thesa sat in the darkness of her office for a long time, thinking about what all of this meant. Then she began composing her report to the Mordani High Council. The human relief mission is not a political gesture, she wrote, her fingers trembling slightly as they moved across the input surface. It is an expression of something fundamental to their species psychology. Humans do not view self-sacrifice as extraordinary, she continued. They view it as a baseline expectation for any situation where sacrifice might help others. This has profound implications for our strategic calculations. Thesa paused, searching for the right words to convey the conclusion that had been forming in her mind over 3 months of observation. A species willing to die for strangers is a species that does not fear death in the same way we do, she finally wrote. This means standard deterrence models do not apply to humans, but more importantly, we must consider what such a species would do to protect something it truly values. The humans are giving their lives freely for beings they have no connection to. What would they do for their own children? What would they do for their home world? What would they sacrifice to protect something they actually loved? Thesa ended her report with a recommendation that the High Council reassess all diplomatic and military strategies involving Earth, attaching the historical files she had compiled as supporting evidence. Then she sat back and waited for a response that she knew would take days to arrive. The council would read her report. They would review her evidence, and if they were wise, they would reach the same conclusion she had reached. The humans were not dangerous because they had powerful weapons or advanced technology. They were dangerous because they had something far more terrifying. They had a complete and total disregard for their own survival when others were in need, and that kind of species could not be threatened, could not be intimidated, and could not be predicted using any model the Mordani had ever developed. For the first time in her career, Thesa felt genuinely afraid of another sapient species, not because they might attack her people, but because she had absolutely no idea what they might do next. The great chamber of the Galactic Senate stretched outward like a bowl carved from living crystal, and within its curved walls sat representatives from over 200 spacefaring species, each one watching the central platform with expressions that ranged from fear to despair to cold calculation. Senator Crickstall of the Mordani Collective raised his forearms in a gesture that demanded silence, and the murmuring voices that filled the chamber slowly died away until only the soft hum of translation devices remained. "We face a crisis unlike any in recent memory," Crickstall announced, his deep voice echoing through the acoustic amplifiers built into the ancient walls. "The Volthari plague has spread to 3 star systems and shows no signs of slowing." Holographic displays flickered to life above the central platform, showing images that made even the most hardened senators look away in discomfort. The plague did not kill quickly or cleanly. It transformed its victims over the course of months, breaking down cellular structures while keeping the nervous system intact so that every moment of dissolution was felt with perfect clarity. Entire worlds had been quarantined, their populations left to suffer and die behind barriers of warships that would destroy any vessel attempting to leave. "The affected species have made their choice," continued Crickstall, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had already accepted the mathematics of survival. "Containment is the only option that protects the rest of us." A ripple of agreement moved through the chamber, though it was the kind of agreement born from fear rather than conviction. No, one wanted to speak the truth that hung in the air like poison. Billions were being left to die, and the Senate was doing nothing except watching. That was when the doors at the far end of the chamber opened, and Ambassador Yoon Se-han of Earth walked in. She was small by the standards of most species present, barely reaching the chest height of the average Mordani, and her simple black suit stood in stark contrast to the elaborate robes and ceremonial armor worn by other delegates. Yet something in the way she moved drew every eye in the room. She walked like someone who had never learned to be afraid. "The chair recognizes the human delegation," said the presiding officer, a Velkith whose silver scales shimmered under the chamber lights. "Ambassador Yoon, you requested emergency speaking time." "I did," Yoon replied, and her voice was calm and clear as she stepped onto the central platform. "I have an announcement to make on behalf of the United Earth Government." Crickstall leaned forward in his seat, all 4 eyes narrowing with suspicion. The humans were newcomers to the galactic stage, having achieved faster than light travel barely 2 centuries ago. They were considered clever but unremarkable, a minor species that had yet to prove itself in matters of real importance. "Earth is dispatching 12 hospital ships to the quarantine zones," Yoon announced, and her words fell into a silence so complete that even the translation devices seemed to pause. "Along with 15,000 volunteer medical personnel who will work directly with plague victims in the affected systems." For a long moment, No one moved. Then the chamber erupted. "Impossible," shouted a delegate from the Creth Union, his tentacles writhing with agitation. "No protective equipment can withstand prolonged exposure to the Vulture pathogen. The mortality rate for caregivers exceeds 90%, added another voice. This one, belonging to a tall insectoid whose species name Yoon could not pronounce. "Your people would be walking into certain death. We are aware of the risks," Yoon replied. And there was something in her tone that made the shouting gradually subside. "Our volunteers have been fully briefed on the survival statistics." Crickstall rose from his seat, his ceremonial robe billowing around him like a storm cloud made solid. "This is absurd," he declared, pointing one clawed finger at the human ambassador. "Political theater designed to make Earth look noble while achieving nothing of substance. Perhaps," Yoon acknowledged with a slight nod. "Or perhaps humans simply cannot stand by while others suffer. Then your species is suicidal." "No, Senator," Yoon said. And for the first time something like steel entered her voice. "We are human. And we do not abandon those in pain when there is anything at all we can do to help them." She turned to address the full chamber, her small form somehow commanding attention from beings that towered over her by meters. "Our medical teams will deploy within 3 standard weeks," she continued. "We ask nothing in return. We demand no political concessions. And we expect no gratitude." "Then why?" The question came from the Velkith presiding officer, whose silver scales had gone pale with what might have been shock. "Why sacrifice your people for strangers who would not do the same for you?" Yoon was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft but carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "Because someone has to," she said simply. "Because suffering is suffering regardless of what species experiences it. And because every life we save matters, even if we lose our own in the saving." She stepped down from the platform and began walking toward the exit, pausing only once to look back over her shoulder. "The ships launch in 20 days, she said. "Any species wishing to contribute supplies or personnel is welcome to join us." Then she was gone, and the chamber remained frozen in stunned silence. Senator Crickstall slowly sank back into his seat, his forearms hanging limp at his sides as he processed what he had just witnessed around him. Intelligence officers from 12 different species were already reaching for their communication devices, sending urgent messages back to their home governments. The reports all carried the same essential warning: the humans were either completely insane or they were hiding something far more dangerous than any weapon the galaxy had ever seen, a species willing to die for. Strangers was a species that did not think like other species, and that made them unpredictable in ways that demanded immediate investigation. As the Senate session formally closed and delegates began filing out of the chamber, hushed conversations filled the air like the buzzing of disturbed insects. Everyone was talking about the humans. Everyone was wondering what they really wanted, and no one could quite believe that the answer might simply be nothing at all.